Hey, what's up out there? The Cat this time. In this video, we're going to be looking at hair. We already made a video kind of like this, but today we're going to be looking at hair from a different era. In this video, we're going to be looking at one of the most popular hairstyles of the 1960s, the mop top. Now, the mop top started in the early 60s and lasted throughout the 60s, but of course, just like a lot of other haircuts, this haircut has seen different variations and has an evolution. Alright, so let's get into this. So, where did this haircut come from and who popularized it? I think this one's kind of hard to argue. It was the Beatles. So of course the Beatles, a Liverpool band from England, they were hitting it big back home, and then in 1964, they went over to the US, and they were hitting it big in the US, and then right afterwards hitting it big basically everywhere else. So these guys were easily recognizable, and their hair really helped with that. It became almost like a trademark. Now, something that I find interesting about this hair is that a lot of interviewers would kid them about their hair, saying that it's long and shaggy and all that. All you need to do is go on YouTube and look up the Beatles interviews between the years 1963 and maybe around 1966. You'll find that their hair was a popular topic for interviewers. So something that I think is quite interesting is the fact that so many people were drawn by their hair. Now, in these interviews, a lot of them would ask, when are you cutting your hair and things like that. And you could see very quickly that it was pretty obvious that society didn't necessarily look too kindly to their hair. Maybe in the youth they would think that it was pretty cool, but a lot of people would kid them about their hair, saying that it's, you know, very long and maybe not considered neat. And I think during that time period, there was a norm in society where hair was kept pretty neat and short. Especially for men. And if we look at the 1950s, the common hairstyle was to have your hair kind of combed around. There was a lot of exposed forehead, exposed hairline kind of hairstyles, and I think that was the most popular thing to do in the 50s, was to have your hair kind of combed back. And usually these haircuts were pretty formal and neat looking. Now, what I think is interesting about the mop top is it's pretty anti-50s. It's kind of like in the 90s we had a lot of hairstyles that were very anti-80s. The reason why I say that is because I think what I said is true. If you look at the most popular hairstyles of the 1950s, a big hunk of them was hair that was combed back. Of course there was the greaser thing, but even people who weren't necessarily greasers and had more of a moderate kind of combed back hair, that was still kind of like the norm for men, just to kind of have like combed back hair and kept pretty short. Although greasers would wear it pretty long at the top, but often would keep it kind of short at the back. But for the most part, I think that's true. Combed around and exposed forehead. Now the Beatles, their hair was combed down, combed basically straight down, although some of them wore it a little bit in a swoop. But it was just combed down, and they didn't keep their hair tidy at the back per se. It was just kind of long at the ear. It was just, it looks like they just kind of grew their hair out instead of actually having it tapered down and had it cut in a way where it looks neat. So that's kind of how you rock the mop top hairstyle. Just long fringes, kind of long at the ear, kind of goes down at the back of the neck, and it's a pretty basic haircut. It kind of just looks like you grew it out. But it wasn't just the Beatles who were wearing this haircut, because the British invasion really solidified this haircut, because most of the guys that came in during this time wore the mop top just like the Beatles. So if you're unfamiliar with the British invasion, this was a time in history where all these British bands were starting to show up in the US and hitting it big, and they were among the most popular types of music. So like the Rolling Stones, the Who, of course the Beatles. There was a number of them. Those are just sort of a lot of the top names. But anyway, as we move on in the 60s, we can see that this hairstyle started to have an evolution. In the early 60s, it looked a lot more neat. A lot of the times, it was kind of combed to the side a little bit of a swoop, if not just combed straight down, but usually falling just before eye length. But as the 60s rolled on, the length part of the haircut started to become more of a thing. So if we look at the mid-60s, we can see that most of these groups, they wore their hair a lot longer. Although being the same haircut, it does look like they refrained from actually cutting their hair. We can use the Beatles as an example, and they are a prime example. If we look at their early albums, their mop top was cut quite short, ending above the eyebrows, sometimes at the eyebrow, but seeing out of their eyes was not a problem. Now, if we continue on in the mid-60s, if we look at their albums, you can see that their hair is getting lengthy. Their hair is getting in their eyes, and oftentimes they would wear a swoop. Specifically in 1964, we can see that with John Lennon and Ringo Starr. Paul McCartney a little bit, kind of having a little bit of a swoop, getting it out of their eyes. And their hair at the ear, oftentimes we could just see the bottom of it, rather than seeing a lot of it as before. More or less, their hair just grew longer. Some people would cut it straight across. George Harrison is an example of that. He would often cut it straight across so that he can see. He wasn't much of the swoop guy, although we can see him with the swoop at one point. But for the most part, he never really wore it in a swoop. He would just kind of practice cutting it straight across. Now, this is an important point, because George Harrison wasn't the only one who would practice cutting his hair straight across, because a lot of guys would do this. A lot of people avoided the swoop thing and would rather just have it cut straight across as they let the rest of their hair grow. For some reason, this was a trend. There was a lot of men during that time, especially in the music industry. They would wear their mop tops, but then the ear and the hair at the back would keep growing, but the hair at the front, they would just keep cutting it. And of course, a lot of people just went for the swoop. So let's quickly take a look at some people that I've been able to pinpoint who practice cutting the top of their hair and not the sides and back. So if we look at this guy here, he's from the Byrds. He is one person who kept cutting his hair at the top, right across the eyes, and he let the rest of it grow. At a certain point, his hair all around got pretty long, while the hair at the top maintains a certain length. Another person we can look at is Brian Jones from the Rolling Stones. He is another person who kept having his hair cut at the top. If we look at him in the early years, he had the typical mop top of the early 60s, where it looked pretty neat, it was pretty proportionate, but it was quite obvious that he kept cutting his bangs. Towards the end of the 60s, his hair all around got pretty long. We'll talk about that in a bit. Now, as we move on, let's talk about how the evolution of the hair, how it looked later on in the 60s, because, again, there is a trend to see here. Now, a lot of these guys would maintain cutting the top, or just the front of the hair. At first it wasn't everybody, so it seemed. Some people went for the swoop, but then having the chopped bangs became more and more popular as the 60s rolled on. It became cooler to have long hair, but the bangs maintained the same. So let's look at the Beatles, for example. Now if we look at the Beatles, they had the mop tops, and of course in 1966, at the end of the year, they all pretty much gave up on that hairstyle, except for George Harrison. Now he kept his hair for a while, but as the 60s rolled on, he still kept having his bangs cut, and so did some of the other Beatles. Ringo Starr and Paul McCartney also practiced this, but let's look at John Lennon for a second here. He is somebody who never had his bangs cut from the beginning. His hair was always in a swoop, avoiding getting into his eyes, and I guess he never really liked that chopped look, where instead of the hair being swooped, his hair would have been just combed straight down as some of the other mop tops we've seen. George Harrison most of the time kept his hair combed straight down, but John Lennon always had his hair kind of brushed to the side, which I think works for him. But as the hair became longer for everybody, as most groups would tend to do, just grow their hair out, John Lennon never had his bangs cut. He never had his hair edited. he just grew out his bangs. So if you look at him, as the 60s are getting to a close end, he always had the long fringe, just had long hair. Whereas George Harrison, Paul McCartney, and Ringo Starr, they would actually practice cutting their bangs. And eventually, it kind of looks like George Harrison kind of gave up on that. As we can see on the Abbey Road cover, his hair is long everywhere, not just the bangs cut and then long everywhere as we've seen earlier. Ringo Starr, he kept doing that himself, but kind of looks like he gave up on it a little bit too, but I think he gave it up a little bit later than George Harrison, because his hair at the top by 1969 looks, it does look shorter, but it's not like chopped over the eyes. Now, Paul McCartney, he kept having the bangs cut. He's someone who just stuck with it, let his hair grow everywhere else. So you can see throughout the 60s and the later years, he had like a hybrid of the mop top, but his hair was longer on the ear and at the back, where his hair was a similar length from before at the top, if not sometimes shorter. Alright, now let's look at some of the other groups just as reference, because it's not just the Beatles who did this as a trend, cutting the bangs and letting the hair grow everywhere else. A lot of other people would do this. So let's take a look. The Rolling Stones is a good example. Almost everybody in the band kept their bangs cut except for the drummer. But then, in 1971, this happened. I don't know what's going on here, but that's kind of a funky looking mullet. I don't even know what to call that. But he's one person who, throughout the 60s, kept the bangs and did not cut it. But it became the more popular thing to do, so I've been able to see. I think it's pretty easy to see that cutting your hair in bangs and having everything else long was kind of where the mop top ended up going. So the mop top kind of had an evolution where it was kind of like a longer mop top, but your hair was cut straight across at the front. But then at a certain point, if it gets too long, then it's just long hair with bangs. And this hairstyle was very popular in the 1970s. So we can see where the evolution of that came about. So a lot of these guys who wore their hair long with bangs in the 70s, it actually came from the mop top, but they just kept cutting the front. Alright, so we're going to look at someone in particular now, and the reason why we're looking at this person is because this person had every version, every variation of the mop top basically possible. This person is probably the most famous drummer in the world, and that is Ringo Starr. So, if you're a Beatles fan, you might get a kick out of this video. So let's take a look at his hair. So, in the early 60s, we can see he had his hair as a mop top, but kind of the neat version, kind of short, not necessarily getting in his eyes, proportionate. His hair at the ear, it's pretty tidy, nothing too crazy. People probably wouldn't kid him too much about his hair in the early days. But then he just let his hair grow long. Didn't get a haircut for a while. If we look at 1964, his hair got in his eyes and he started wearing the swoop. A very natural looking mop top. Similar to how John Lennon had it. And that's the way John Lennon kept it basically until he gave up the mop top look. But then, in 1965, we can see Ringo chopped his bangs. He didn't cut the rest of his hair, it doesn't look like. He just cut his bangs straight across. Kind of looking like Coconut Head from Ned's Guide. Anyway, so this is something that Ringo Starr actually started doing, especially in the year 1965. He started doing this in 1966 as well. But he started cutting the bangs. If we take a look at a little bit later in the year, he tidied up the rest of his hair and it looked pretty proportionate. So he kind of went back to having a more natural, proportionate look. He also had it where the mop top looked very blunty looking, with no layers. And so this is a different variation too. But it's not natural looking like before. His hair doesn't look like it has layers in this photo. And he's had the variation where it's basically cut at the ear straight across, cut at the bangs straight across, leaving kind of an unnatural kind of mop top look, not like before in 1964. Now, after Ringo got it cut back to more of a proportionate look, we can see this during the time of when the Rubber Soul album came out. But then, the next year, he was still cutting the bangs. I guess after the bangs got in his eyes again, he just kept cutting it and keeping it long everywhere else. I wonder if he would actually cut it himself, just straight across. In 1966, we can see Ringo Starr started wearing his hair pretty long on the back and sides, and he would often comb it behind his ears, which is kind of interesting. Would people say this is still a mop top? I think so. I think there is a certain point where if it's still kept at a certain length, it still maintains that look. He kind of had this hair for the last time in 1967. We can see this during the Sgt. Pepper photo shoots. But then afterwards, he had the typical thing where he kept cutting his bangs. So he kind of had like this longer, yet more natural looking version of the mop top, but kept cutting it at the bangs. And eventually his hair became basically just long hair with some bangs. Alright, so let's ask the question. At what point is it no longer a mop top? Because it seems like there's different variations. For example, most people would call this a mop top. This is a version that is kept pretty neat. Neat at the back, kinda not too long at the ear, but most people would consider this a mop top. Now, this is another example of a mop top, but the proportions are completely different. It's pretty chopped at the eyes, although some would wear it at a similar length with a little bit of a swoop. But people would still consider this a mop top. I think the underlying thing of what people consider a mop top is probably the bangs, the fringe that covers your forehead. So, if we look at some of these references, we can see that the bangs, despite the hair at the side and back, a lot of the times are pretty much the same length, kind of like eye length. So for the most part, no matter what the sides and back look like, the top at the front is pretty much the same. So I think the underlying thing of what the public considers a mop top has to do with the bangs. But I do think at a certain point, how the back and sides look changes whether or not it is considered a mop top. So let's take a look at this hair for a second. So, is this a mop top? Now, there is a hairstyle nicknamed Dutch boy hair. It's not the most popular term, but I've heard it every now and then. But this, the public probably won't say is a mop top. Probably not. You can comment in the comment section whether or not you consider this a mop top, but some people like to nickname this Dutch boy hair. It has to do with the Dutch boy paint thing, the little kid as a logo. But, even myself, I would have a hard time saying this is a mop top at this point, because it looks like it's going for something completely different. And it's funny, because there's these weird delicacies where there's only a slight bit difference between this hair. And that is just basically the proportions. So for example, the bangs are pretty chopped, not even eye length. A lot of this Dutch boy hair actually falls above the eyes. So it kind of has that dissonant proportion look, whereas the hair on the sides and back are a lot longer, often all one length. If not all one length, close to being all one length. And the lack of layering probably doesn't help either. So, in my personal opinion, there is a certain point where it's no longer a mop top, and that all depends on the proportions. And of course there's other different variations. Sometimes the proportions are very long at the back, but still reasonably short at the ear. But let's look at this. I'm not sure if most of the public would consider this a mop top, but this is definitely a hybrid of the mop top. Now, the references that we're going to be looking at, particularly the Beach Boys and the family band the Cowsills, they had kind of a variation of the mop top. Now, in the early stages of the Beach Boys, we had a couple of the members wear their hair pretty long at the top, but pretty neat at the back and sides. I don't know if this was a surfer thing, maybe not, but this looks mop top-ish, but it's like not quite, if you get what I mean. The hair is pretty long at the top, but the proportions are quite different. It's neat on the back and sides, but the hair is pretty long on the top, often wearing it in a swoop. If we take a look at the Cowsills, they had a similar thing going on, and some of the brothers actually wore it in kind of like a part instead of just kind of a swoop. So I think this is kind of a different variation, but I'm not sure if people would consider this a mop top or if it's just like a bangs look, because the proportions are a little bit different. This looks more neat because the proportions at the ear and the back are actually shorter, whereas the other references we were looking at is actually longer at the sides and at the back. But looking at the Cowsills and the Beach Boys, these are two bands that had the same fate as everybody else. Their hair just grew longer and longer and longer until it became like a shaggy long look as the 70s rolled in. And I would argue that they did the same thing as everybody else, kind of editing their hair at the front, but leaving the back and sides to grow longer over time. Now, I've heard every now and then someone say the Beatles have mushroom cuts. Now, this is something that I don't agree with, because I feel like the mushroom cut very much has the tapered down back and sides. The Beatles never had hair like that. The most that they've had is like really chopped looking hair, particularly Ringo Starr. He's had very helmety looking hair, but I feel like the mushroom cut is very cut down, giving it that sort of slimming down at the back and side, which the Beatles never wore the hair like, although I can find photo reference where it looked pretty close. Now, of course, we also had modern hybrids of the mop top. A lot of the skater dude look kind of had that similar thing going, although the swoop thing was really reinforced. I think most of us knew a person who would do that head flip thing so that their hair stays flipped to the side. It's kind of funny watching people who had this hair who would walk against the wind when the draft wasn't in favor of their hair. Anyway, that's my piece. We took a close look at the mop top haircut, a hair that really solidified itself in the 1960s and has become kind of iconic. Thanks for watching, means a lot. Tune in next time where my twin brother and I are going to be doing whatever we're doing, whether it be like songs, cartoons, skits, weird odd videos like this about hair. Anyways, peace and love, means a lot.